So one day when I was 16, my grandmother and I started off a pretty normal conversation. She said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm good." And she said, "Don't say that. It means you're good in bed." She said, "You should always say, 'I'm well.'" My 16-year-old self was mortified. So much so that for years afterwards, I would always take special care to answer, "I am well," whenever someone asked me how I was. Now, before I go on, I'm curious how many people here think it's acceptable to say, "I'm good," as an answer to that question. What about online? How do people feel online about that? Just curious. Raise your hand. One raised hand. Okay, out of how many, though? Only 1 out of 7. Wow, the online people have a feeling. What about "I'm well"? Who thinks that's appropriate to say? Okay, interesting, interesting. I know you're all like, "I'm on the "I'm fine" train." Well, when I was in my late 20s, my boss at an LGBTQ plus nonprofit asked me how I was, right, after years of me taking care to say I'm well. And I responded, "I'm well," like I usually do, and he said, "Geez, Otto, you always sound so proper and educated." It was not a compliment. I was a little taken aback. This is how I was taught to speak. And by that point, I'd had a lot of my Canadianisms, if you'll remember I'm Canadian, I had a lot of them drilled out of me. That O sound when I said sorry was slowly drifting to the American sorry. I'd been laughed at enough that I no longer said pasta and drama, replacing them with the American pasta and drama, which just sounds so pretentious to me, but whatever. Had it been a Canadian thing to say "I'm well," or was it more of a class and education thing, or perhaps both? This wouldn't be the first time at a job I was told that I spoke too formally. When I was a ministerial intern in my first congregation, my intern committee told me that my sermons didn't sound conversational enough, that my language was too stilted and proper. So I go back through my sermons and replace all the "I ams" and "we wills" with the contractions, "I'm" and "will." Will? It was hard to change my writing to align with how people spoke, and I still have to do this sometimes when I go through my sermons, so I don't end up sounding like Data, an android from the next generation of Star Trek, who for some reason can't use contractions. But this was my background, proper grammar in writing and speech, and it was held up as important in all aspects of my life. Still, in the years since this conversation with my grandmother, who I loved dearly despite her correcting my grammar on all sorts of things, in these years since that exchange, I haven't been able to find a single reference that implies saying "I'm good" means something about one's sexual prowess. It does, however, according to some, mean a moral judgment. Saying "I'm good" to someone means essentially saying "I'm morally good," which is basically what I'm saying when I call myself a reverend. I'm saying I am to be revered, which is a whole other conversation, but suffice it to say, I would also be horrifically embarrassed to be saying that I was morally good to anyone who asked me how I was. Now, you've probably come across this kind of generational language differences, where one generation has an idea of what correct speech is, either in written or spoken, and is passed along sometimes forcefully to the next generation. In addition to the "I'm good" exchange, for example, a common refrain I'd hear when I would say "Can I go to the bathroom?" is "I don't know, can you?" Anyone else hear that? Yep. But here's the thing, once I knew that I was getting older as an adult, once slang words that were in the common youth speak became just a bit out of my grasp. I think the first time for me was when the word basic became widespread to mean someone who follows trends and drinks pumpkin spiced lattes, which according to Urban Dictionary was popular around the time that I turned 30, which makes sense. Part of youth speak is that it's intended to be not intended to be understood by older people. It's intended to help understand those who are part of the in-group, in this case young people, and who's part of the out-group, people over 30. And around when I turned 30, that's when I became part of the out-group. Don't trust anyone over 30. They say it for a reason. But the thing about kids these days is that they grow up. And some of the language they use and some of the ways they speak change our language completely. We know this intrinsically, right? We don't speak the same language as Shakespeare. We don't speak the same language as the early Puritans. We don't even speak or write the same way we did in 1900 or 1950 or 2000 even. So why do we often have so much trouble, especially some of us, when grammar and meanings of words start to evolve and change? One place I've seen this come up a lot is with the use of singular they. The fact that it's become a more common word, especially in reference to folks who are non-binary, as in those who don't identify as women or men, has become a common source of grammatical strife. Now, this is not a sermon about singular use they. I don't think y'all need convincing to do that. Note that I, a Canadian, just used the plural version of you, y'all, which originated in the South, and many of you probably weren't fazed by that. But singular use they, though actually in use for a longer has actually been in use for a longer time than our current iteration. And it's flared up a lot of concerns over how to use it in a grammatically correct way. Yet this completely ignores, if we completely ignore the fact that it's been used before, so even if it wasn't used before, let's think about the fact that language isn't static. These words can change meaning. So why does it sometimes feel so hard to hear something like they in a sentence referring to one person? Or, to use something a little less charged, why do some people have so much trouble hearing literally for something that's not literal? Or when somebody hears a so-called double negative or a split infinitive, like to boldly go, a most popular one. Sorry, I'm just getting my Star Trek references out today. Well, for many of us, particularly those of us who are white and educated in the way I was, I attended private school and went to university, college, where writing proper English was emphasized, we will notice these so-called grammatical errors in someone else's speech. But I think it's important to consider what makes something a grammatical error when language is always in flux, always evolving. Well, it turns out we're taught there is only one right way to speak English, right? And it's based on a few stylistic guides that really were about someone with power's personal preference about language. Linguist Valerie Fridland writes in her book, which is titled, Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good and Bad English. She says most of what we are taught and think of as language rules are actually just social preferences, decided by those invested in codifying English usage so that it could be transmitted across time and space. A noble and necessary aim, to be sure, but over time we have confused such externally imposed standards, often modeled on the model of Latin and based on the speech of the upper crust, with inherent goodness and correctness. So I think there's the rub. This idea that there is a good and correct way of speaking English is actually an elitist convention of who decided that this was the way that we should all speak and write. But language is more complicated, more nuanced than that. The way we speak and write to an extent tells us much more about our social location, our age, class, gender, race, and where we're located geographically than we might realize. And to the degree that we believe that there is an appropriate standard way we should all speak, ignores the fact that most people don't grow up learning standard English. That is, the English of the academics, the proper grammar. Ibram X. Kendi talks in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, about the reaction of the predominantly white culture to the English dialect known as African American vernacular, or Black English, a form of speech that's often looked down on by the dominant culture as uneducated and ignorant, despite having its own grammatical and vocabulary rules that all speakers much know and internalize. In fact, there is such a difference as relevant as an internal set of rules between so-called standard English and African American vernacular that in 1996, the Oakland School Board recognized those who spoke it as bilingual, something that upset a whole lot of people. Yet in some ways, as Kendi points out, this makes a whole lot of sense. Many countries that enslaved people ended up with different languages based on what those enslaved people spoke. Take Haiti, for example. Enslaved people were taken primarily from West Africa, brought to a country where enslavers spoke French, and they spoke different languages from the other enslaved people, which created a new language with vocabulary based on French, but completely different spelling and grammar. Would you consider somebody who spoke both French and Haitian Creole bilingual? Then, if you said yes, you might want to consider what it means for somebody to be able to speak African American vernacular and so-called standard English. Perhaps those who are able to speak both have the same level of proficiency as someone who's bilingual. Often the ability to change how someone is speaking from Black English to standard English is referred to as part of code switching, the way in which someone speaks a different dialect of English needs to translate their speech in order to be able to get a job, graduate from college, or just generally not be seen as ignorant. But might it actually be more impressive to be able to speak in both of those dialects and languages? There is such a persistent issue with our culture's judgment of Black speech that Black children are much more likely to be diagnosed with speech disorders, where none exist, according to Scientific American. But the main difference between so-called standard English and African American vernacular is who taught it, who speaks it, and what we think about those people. Our idea that there is only one right way to speak English is indeed a reflection of white supremacy culture. What's more is that often these words and terms become part of standard English only once they start being used by white youth, who then grow up to become those in power, the ones making decisions about how speech is used, without recognizing that these same terms were looked down upon by white culture just a generation ago. And who makes the decisions when something is part of primary culture, part of standard American white English? Well, of course, we have dictionaries and usage guides, which are essentially grammar guides for standard English. And both of those documents are a reflection of our culture rather than a directive of how we have to talk or speak. Last year, 2023, for example, the word "riz" was added, meaning having a certain charisma, or a word you might want to be described as. It means it reflects that this is in common enough usage to be in our dictionary, though I never use it. Anybody here use "riz" regularly? Yes, some people who work with kids maybe over there. The American Heritage Dictionary has a rather prestigious panel of people who decide if it's appropriate to say "I'm good" as well as "I'm well" in writing. But the point is, these things are all decided by people to be a reflection of our culture, not hard and fast rules that we all have to abide by. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is to challenge you to think about language differently than you might ordinarily. When you get an email or a text with a grammatical mistake, does it matter if you correct it? If someone is using the incorrect version of your, doesn't matter if you understand the meaning. If you are someone who hires people at a job, how much are you paying attention to how the person writes or speaks? And how important is that to their job? And if it is important, why is it important? Is it to impress a certain kind of person? That's often been how I've been taught to think about language, despite being in jobs where people have told me that I spoke too properly. But I want us to think about how language and how we can use language differently to help us dismantle white supremacy culture. Because the language that we accept as proper is a reflection of that culture. One of the gifts of Unitarian Universalism and First Parish is that we come here to help us question our assumptions about ourselves and each other. But if we are truly to practice compassion and understanding, we have to break out of some of our comforts of what is standard around us and what others might use. Language evolving is, of course, only one aspect of this, understanding these differences among us. As time goes on, we've changed many things about who we are, how we dress, for example. When I started here, I wore a robe and a stole every Sunday because that's what you were used to. This morning, I'm not even wearing a tie. Super casual. Soup's cash, as I like to say. I bet that none of you, and maybe I'm wrong, but I bet that none of you were bothered by my lack of robe and stole. Was anybody bothered? Anyone online? But you might have noticed a few years ago, or if I looked a lot younger than I am now that I've started balding, or if I wasn't white, or if I was a woman. Those are the kind of little things like language that we need to question our judgments about. So I invite you to think over the next week or month about how you speak and how those around you speak, and what words you use or don't use, what words other people use that bother you, and what does that say about your biases and judgments. And keep saying things like, "I'm good," without reservation, because language is evolving, and so are we. May it be so. Let us say together, Amen. Amen.